Chapter 1. Akwala the Tormented Spirit. It all started long ago when King Sayumba was on his way to his kingdom, along with a few guards and a slave. He was in a hurry because a festival was about to take place in his kingdom, and his presence was highly required. He was in such a hurry that he was not really watching his way when he inadvertently stepped on a tormented spirit. Akwala was the tormented spirit who was disowned by his master. At the time of King Sayumba's journey, he was hopelessly lying around thinking of what would become of him when his melancholy was so rudely interrupted. Akwala was desperate and famished, so hungry that he was in no mood to be civil, and this interruption presented him with the perfect opportunity to change his fortunes. Meanwhile, the incident left King Sayumba sprawled on the ground, and his guards who surrounded him tried to help him up when they all shuddered to a voice. "Why did you trample on me? By the gods, you shall pay for this," the spirit bellowed. They all looked around to see to whom the voice belonged to, but were only met by the dust of wild in the eddies of wind. "Pardon us. I knew not that you were there," Sayumba answered, accepting his guilt. "You can keep your pardon. Do not for a moment think that I care, because I don't," the voice returned. By this time it dawned on the guards, who were referred to as the butlers, that this terrifying voice belonged to no human, and they were all petrified. King Sayumba was the only one who wasn't all that scared. He, however, had to acknowledge the little nervousness gnawing on him. This wasn't the first time he had such an encounter, but nonetheless he knew this particular experience was a bit different because the spirit seemed bitter, and he braced himself for what he knew was not going to be an easy ordeal. "I sincerely apologize. We were in such a hurry that we were not really watching our way. Please do let us go. It is important that I get to my palace right away," Sayumba pleaded. "What? I couldn't let you go. How else will I quench this thirst for blood inside me? I want blood now, and none of you will leave until I am satiated." Akwala excitedly screamed at the king and his party, wasting no time in making known his true intentions. He was hungry, and all he could see was his next meal. "Blood? What blood? But I mean, where do I get that from?" Sayumba asked, although he had a sunken feeling that he knew exactly what the spirit meant by his request. He looked around at his guards, and his sight was beset on a terrified bunch of people whose fear of death was evidenced by the quiver of their stance. This was a far cry from the custom of their land and what they were all born to do as butlers. "Butlers! Is this our end?" he shouted out, wondering where his Gideon was. Rallying the butlers and praise singing is supposed to be his work. Kanjura Gari is his name. He came forth with his leopard skin flute and started praise singing. "Never before have I been so ashamed to travel with the fearsome butlers of the Tongunte kingdom. It should be an honor to die for the king and the kingdom, for your name shall forever be sung by generations to come. But you lot are not worthy of being called butlers," he sang. King Sayumba was one of the wealthiest kings who ruled in the ancient Tongunte kingdom. His real name was Marikoto Sayumba. He was a descendant of a long line of rulers of the Tongunte kingdom called the Sayumba royals. Marikoto Sayumba was a great king who was widely known and respected as a man of his word. His kingdom was one of the best and wealthiest of all the kingdoms of West Africa. It was fondly called Tongo. It has been under the rule of the Sayumba royals for centuries. Many kingdoms near and far have tried to conquer it, but it always emerged victorious. The royals were a much feared tribe of warriors who were tasked to undertake a gruesome journey before they were crowned as kings. This journey tested their bravery, endurance, compassion, and honor, and stretched them to the end. Every true Sayumba king must endure this journey to be considered a worthy ruler of the Tongo kingdom. "By the gods of our land, I shall live and die only in the service of my beloved king. Let me be the one to die for my king and kingdom," offered a slave from the king's party. Roused by the shame that he felt over the butlers and his love for the king, he was resigned to sacrifice himself to save King Sayumba. The king was surprised and in awe of this gesture from a poor slave. However, this could not temper the disappointment and despair he felt over his butler's cowardice. The offer of self-sacrifice was as much a surprise to Kanjura the Giriot and the guards as it was to the king. No less because the slave was an old man who had served the Sayumba royals and the people of Tungunte all his life. All eyes were now on the slave. He was a weary old man who was all grey but still seemed strong. He approached the king and continued, "I shall sacrifice myself in your place, but on one condition." Dama the slave saw this as the only opportunity he would ever have to bargain with the king. "And what is your name, noble slave?" Kanjura calmly asked. "My name is Dama. Dama Ture from the Ture clan," he feebly answered. "The Tures? Oh, I remember. His father served your grandfather and father all his life until he joined his ancestors. The Tures have always been known for their decency, loyalty and selfless sacrifice to the royal family. Dama Ture is the son of the late Baleme Ture, a true servant of the Tungunte kingdom and a descendant of the Ture clan." Kanjura played his flute whilst he said this, leading Dama towards King Sayumba, who was pleased to hear this. "And what is this favor you ask of me?" King Sayumba asked Dama. "Your Majesty, all my life has been lived in the service of your noble family and Dongu. I have watched my father and grandfather both dedicate their lives in the service of the Sayumba royals and the people of the great Tungunte kingdom. This has been a duty conferred upon us for generations. We willingly served you with honor, and not once have we asked for anything in return. However, today, as I am about to sacrifice myself in your place, may I humbly make a request of you for something I have always wanted," Dama nervously began. "Your Majesty, I have always dreamt of ushering my family out of slavery. Even though we have been honored to serve and die at your feet, I wish for us to be freed from slavery." Before the king could respond to Dama's request, Kanjura jumped in and began protesting against Dama's request. "You ask for the impossible. This can never be done. A common slave pleading to be freed? Impossible. That can only happen if a king marries a slave, which our tradition forbids." Kanjura Gadi protested at Dama's request to the king. He wouldn't even let the old man speak, and he was right. Dama's request was to everyone an impossibility. They all knew the Tures as one of the oldest slave families of the kingdom. They were born to be slaves, and this was the way it was since the beginning of time. What Dama has requested for was an abomination. At this point, Dama was so desperate for the king to accept his request, and they were losing the precious time that he ignored Kanjura's protests and continued fervently begging the king. "Your Majesty, I want you to promise me that you will free my family from slavery. I want you to promise me that my family shall not continue being slaves forever." The king sighed with a heavy heart at Dama's desperate request. "My slave, I dare to make such a promise lest I fall short of fulfilling it," the king told Dama. At this, Dama fell at his feet and began sobbing heavily. "Your Majesty, I beg of you. It is what I've always wanted. All my life, all I ever did was to serve your Majesty. Although this desire has been but a dream, this is the only opportunity I have to make such a daring request at your feet. Please help me." Tears had started rolling down his cheeks as he looked up at the king. There was a quiver in his voice. Old Dama was desperate and tired of his life of servitude, but he was resigned to his fate of dying as a slave. However, he was determined with everything that he had in him to change the fate of his family and clan. This he considered was to be the only thing he would have ever done for himself and his family. "But Ture, how would you have fulfilled this dream if you are to leave?" Old Dama was in a fit of cough as Kanjura asked this. Akwala was by now fast losing his patience as he looked on at this exchange, and his hunger raged on stronger. "Enough!" he bellowed, causing a shudder to run through everyone's spine once again. "I shall have my meal now." At this rate, the king rushed to conclude his pact with Dama. He turned to him and said, "I give you my word that your request shall be granted one day. It saddens me that I cannot tell you when, for I am at a loss on how to achieve such a feat. I shall ensure that this promise is passed down my lineage until it is fulfilled." "But your Majesty," Kanjura objected, "your daughter, as we all know, is already engaged to the prince of a neighboring kingdom. How then do you wish to fulfill such a promise?" I don't know how, but it shall definitely come to be. For the Sayumba name will not be held in esteem until it is fulfilled. This obligation will be passed down to every Sayumba descendant until my promise to Dama is fulfilled. A Sayumba's word shall always remain his bond. The king responded to Kanjura's protests, all the while looking at Dama, who was now beaming with hope and pride. He added, now glaring at the Giriot with incredulity, Kanjura, this man has been serving my kingdom all his life, and never once has he asked for anything in return. And today, as he so willingly lays his life down for me, no request should be too big for me to grant. The king now turned back to Dama, saying, I hereby promise you, my humble slave, that the Ture shall not remain slaves by your 7th generation. It is a promise. I shall have faith in your word and leave the fate of my clan in your hands, your highness. I shall die content with that promise, my king, and will rest only when my family is freed. This spirit will be our witness, your majesty. As he said this, he gently walked towards where he last had the spirit below, offering himself. The wind then blew stronger and harder until at last, when they all heard old Dama's screams, and he was gone. They stood there for some time in silence, petrified at the event that had just taken place. Kanjura wanted to take on the guards and berate them for their shameful cowardice, but the king would not let him. Although he was equally disappointed, he was a fair and just man, and he knew only too well that an encounter with such a fearsome spirit could only make a coward of even the fiercest of warriors. These guards were willing to protect him against any mortal and human force, and that was good enough for him. They all continued their journey, quietly marching towards the kingdom. Kanjura had then started playing his flute as they headed on, hoping that this would help calm everyone's nerves. When they finally arrived just in time for the festival, they happily joined in all of the festivities, relieved that they were home at last. That night, as King Sayumba sat on his throne after the celebrations, he could not help thinking of Dama and the promise he had made to him. He ordered one of his guards to fetch Kanjura Gari whilst he comfortably leaned back on his throne, almost enjoying his reverie as he was fanned by the servants at both sides of him. He had just closed his eyes when he heard Kanjura play his flute upon his entry into the palace. His palace was quite huge, a historic structure built from stone, burnt mud, and the blood and sweat of the faithful servants of the Tongunte kingdom. There were little huts surrounding the king's quarters where the slaves and servants sleep. My great king, a true king of Tongo, graceful, merciful, and a noble man of his word. You called on me, my king. He bowed his head as he greeted the king in the way that is custom of the land. King Sayumba nodded his acknowledgement of his presence and greeting, urging him to take a seat. Kanjura stood straight and headed towards one of the embedded seats beside the king's throne. Yes, Kanjura, I want you to go inform the late Dama's family of his fate first thing tomorrow morning. Tell them what he did for me and exactly what happened, except for the promise. It shall only be disclosed the time it is to be fulfilled. As you wish, your majesty, Kanjura said as he bowed. I want my promise passed down to every descendant that sits on this throne as a legacy. Therefore, I want it written down, King Sayumba continued. As he spoke, he could sense Kanjura's dissent and displeasure at his request. With this realization, the king stopped to allow Kanjura, who was also his friend, to speak his mind. Your Majesty, I do not mean to defy you, but... Kanjura hesitated, then concluded. Pay no attention to me. It is not my place to say. I command you to speak your mind, the king ordered. Well, I was just thinking of a suitable compromise to Dama's request. What if the Tures were brought here to serve only royalty? Freeing a slave from the bondage of slavery can only be done if a daughter or a son from their clan is given in marriage to the royal family. And that is an abomination in our kingdom. As a matter of truth, a taboo. The king considered what Kanjura had just said and asked, do you believe bringing the Tures here to serve only the Sayumba royals will serve to fulfill the promise I made to Dama? Yes. It is and has always been a great honor to serve the Sayumba royals. Besides, you are king, and as such not subject to the request and demands of any of your subjects. Least of all your slave. Fulfilling Dama's promise is not a wise decision, your majesty. Kanjura concluded his plea to the king, making him ponder over his decision. And the more he pondered on Kanjura's statement, the more he was inclined to agree with him. After all, who is better poised to understand the traditions and customs of the Tongu kingdom if not Kanjura? King Sayumba thought to himself. Furthermore, he knew that the decision to free a whole clan of slaves would not augur well in his council of elders. As he came to alter his decision, he assured himself that apart from himself, Kanjura Gari and a few of the battlers, no other living being knew of his promise to Dama. Having arrived at a decision, King Sayumba wasted no time in summoning the entire Ture clan to his palace to serve only royalty. The Tures, oblivious to the sacrifice made on their behalf by one of their very own and what is owed to them, were honored to be called to serve only the Sayumba royals. They were all contented to know that.